Good morning and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Virginia Legislative Roundtable. I'm Deb Wake, the president, and today we are focused on the environment and flooding and issues like that affect all of us in Virginia, no matter where we live. And we are pleased to have with us today Tim Cywinski. Tim is the communications manager for the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club. So welcome, Tim. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you everyone else. I'm gonna have to adjust this just a little bit so we can see it. And thank you, Mary, for one person in here who gave me applause. So it's a good way to start the day. First off, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that it's Women's History Month. And what a pleasure it is to be here with the League of Women Voters. This job can be pretty hard sometimes, and sometimes it's kind of hard to stay optimistic, and sometimes it's hard to stay involved because there's a lot of disappointments in the realm of advocacy. So it is really nice to be part, in a small way today, of an organization that has been here advocating for so long and for so many important and vital issues. My family has been involved with League of Women Voters since the inception of it. I found out recently going through this, and my grandmother, who was the first blind woman to graduate from college in the state of Florida, actually was one of the people who helped start a chapter of the Federation of Blind. And it was the League of Women Voters who helped her get started. So I have a deep applause for you all. I see it all on the camera and it's fantastic, well deserved, so thank you. I'm gonna switch gears now and talk a little bit more about the environment now. As Deb mentioned, I'm the communications person for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. And there's a lot to report. I know the topic today is about flooding. And so I have to mention a new study that just came out from one of the federal agencies that talked about the dire need to address pollution issues because of its impact on flooding. And some of the statistics really quickly that I'll throw out there is that we can expect by 2030 and the preceding years, we can expect in 30 years a full foot of sea level rise. That has major implications for coastal Virginia. It has major implications for really the entire eastern seaboard. That's one scary statistic. The other scary one is that areas that now expect flooding once every 25 years will have flooding every high tide in about 60 years' time. This is all tied back to, we can't really talk about flooding unless we talk about pollution. And we can't really talk about pollution unless we're talking about people. And that's why we have to stay concerned over this during a General Assembly session. It's one of those issues that is so salient to the livelihoods, that is to the well-being of Virginians, and something that doesn't really get as much attention as other issues because it seems like it's far off. But the fact remains that when we do have flooding, it impacts people's lives. And the negative impact of flooding and other pollution issues is not felt equally. Sure, it does affect everyone, but it is the outcomes that hurt people's lives are mostly concentrated in communities of color. Especially Black Virginians are really impacted by pollution. So let's look at the legislature and where we are with that. At the beginning of this session, there was a lot of attacks on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I think you all have been informed about it beforehand, but quick recap, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI, is an attempt to essentially put a price on pollution and a limit on pollution, and then that money is given to the state, and that money then is disseminated back to our communities. That's RGGI is. It's just making sure that there's limits and a price on pollution so that polluters have to have stake in the game. The money is then disseminated to communities specifically for energy efficiency and for coastal resiliency projects. The coastal resiliency projects are so important because of what I just talked about. I'm happy to report that all of the most significant attacks on RGGI have been defeated. A lot of them originated from the House and from the executive branch, but the Senate of our legislature has remained pretty strong on making sure that they protect RGGI. The second one, of course, that would experience a lot of attacks was the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which again is a lot of different things. Yeah. I'm sorry, I think everyone, there's a few people who aren't muted right now. I just wanted to make sure that.
I'm trying, I'm sorry, I'm doing as fast as I can.
No, it's all right, Joan. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you, well, by the way, setting this up. I didn't see you earlier. So, Joan was perfect. Was great on the logistics side. So quick shout out to Joan. I'm sure Mary will give her a singular applause as well. Anyway, so yeah, back to the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Again, quickly, it's a lot of things, but mostly what it is a commitment, a binding commitment to get rid of carbon pollution in Virginia through our energy sector by 2050. This is huge, mostly because the energy sector is one of the big three things that is driving the climate crisis, which causes the problems that we're going to see with flooding. That again was under attack. Governor Youngkin during his campaign said he would not have signed the bill, and Republicans have said that that they want to get rid of it because the costs of the regulations get passed on consumers. Every study by independent fiscal analysis that we found shows that in the long run, the Virginia Clean Economy Act is actually going to drive down our electric bills. It's actually going to drive down the costs on consumers. The same is true for RGGI. In fact, states that already participate in RGGI have seen a decrease in their bills by 13% compared to states that are not joined to RGGI. So this is a talking point that we hear a lot of, that anytime we try to do attempts that improve people's lives or that try to impact an industry that has negative consequences on our society, that the costs are going to go down to consumers. But in reality, when you hear that, please question it, because that's usually not the case. And it's not the case when it comes to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And it is also not the case with the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So those are the good news. And those are significant ones. And so we shouldn't downplay that. But it has not been perfect this session, because if we're talking about pollution, we have to talk about everything and all the legislation that is pertaining to it. 3 pieces of legislation I want to bring up really quickly, 2 of which have already passed. One was concerning the Air Pollution Control Board meeting. It also experienced a lot of attacks. One bill in particular we found kind of funny was the Air Pollution Control Board meeting had no power to make decisions based off pollution. It's kind of like the whole thing. It's kind of the whole thing that they're part of. That bill didn't pass, but one bill did pass. These citizen boards, including the Air Pollution Control Board and the Water Quality Control Board, they're citizen boards. They're made up of people largely like you and I, but that have expertise in the issue. They're not paid. It's a volunteer level. And it is an important checks and balance on our system, because if our government fails to protect us to pollution, these boards can act as our last line of defense. And they did. Later end of last year, the Mountain Valley Pipeline folks behind the Mountain Valley Pipeline tried to get approval for a toxic compressor station to be built in Pittsylvania County. Pittsylvania County has higher rates of respiratory illness, has higher rates of cancer. And we have to look at all the factors. And one factor we cannot exclude from the health status of that is that there's already 2 compressor stations. Compressor stations, by the way, are one of the most toxic parts of natural gas infrastructure. The Air Pollution Control Board said that we don't think it's appropriate there. This is an environmental justice community. It's directly impacting mostly people of color. There wasn't enough outreach. We reject it. It was the first time it's ever happened in Virginia history. It was unprecedented. There's a bill that was passed that removed the authority of those boards to make decisions like that, remove their authority to deny projects of those requests. For contrast, by the way, DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, petitioned the board to accept the project. So this is a perfect example of checks and balances. And now we've passed a bill that removed that checks and balance from our environmental processes in the state. So that was disappointing. Another one that is disappointing relates back to biogas. Biogas is another entity related to natural gas infrastructure. This one in particular is interesting. It's especially concerning these farms, these factory farms that are pollution heavy. And what the idea is to capture the methane from waste from the animals on them. We passed a bill that would do that, would capture the methane, which by the way is a very potent greenhouse gas. And unfortunately, I don't want to get too much in the weeds of it. Happy to follow up with questions, but this bill incentivized that practice because it created an industry, or created an incentive for an industry that relies on it to produce fuel in a way that we don't believe is good for the communities and the surrounding areas. And it's bad for air quality, and of course, it's bad for climate. So those are another one. Now, there's a third bill that's still up in the air. We've been referring to as the natural gas ban. In its original form, this bill would have removed the authority of localities from essentially passing ordinances that says we don't want natural gas infrastructure anymore. We want to switch to clean energy or electricity or fully electric fuel sources for our energy system. This bill is bad for multiple reasons. One, communities and local leaders should have the right to protect their populations from pollution. This bill would remove any chance of that happening. Two, the natural gas industry has pushed this type of bill throughout the country. It's called a preemptive bill. There's no attacks on it in any of our localities as far as anyone can tell, but it's been passed in multiple different states. And mostly just so that it removes the authority from the first place for people to end up, like I said, protecting people from their pollution. Natural gas oftentimes is thought of as a cleaner sense of fuel, but it's not. It's still bad for air quality, and it releases methane, which is a really bad, potent greenhouse gas pollution, source of pollution. This bill was amended yesterday, and some people that usually wouldn't vote for it did vote in favor of it to go to the floor because there's some promises that they're going to work on this bill. It's a bill, the bill number is slipping from me right now, but if you look up, it's I think Delegate Kilgore is the patron of it, and it talks about localities and natural gas. I'll be happy to follow up with folks if they have any more questions on it. So that's everything that's going on in the legislature. We're following that last bill as close as we can. If you're on our email list, we've been sending out a ton of action alerts where we'll, take this position. I'll send a message directly to your legislators. I'm gonna let you all know something. I know they're annoying, and I'm sorry because I write a lot of those. But what I will also say is that they really are important. This is not just a petition. It's just not assigning something and then we drop it off the desk. This really does make a difference. Our legislative director is a former legislative assistant and says that this is one of the most effective ways to our legislators. This is also one of the most effective ways to make sure that they're educated about a particular issue, especially in a time when a lot of us aren't comfortable going to the legislature and doing that in person. So that's everything in the legislature. We'll mention one more thing because that's somewhat tied to this and somewhat not, but really does underscores the issue. Last week, the Sierra Club Virginia chapter released a report on air toxins in Virginia. And what that report had showed using EPA data, Environmental Protection Data Agency data, is that Virginia, in terms of potential health risks from toxic exposure, is the 8th worst state in the nation. I'm going to say that one more time. 46 states and territories do a better job of protecting their citizens from pollution, from air pollution, than Virginia does. This really just shows that we've given a free pass to polluters for really too long. And the problem with that is that, once again, the highest concentration of risk is in areas specifically for Black Virginians. We've let the livelihoods of those people be sacrificed because we've let polluters dictate the terms. It really just goes to show, again, why organizations like this, why organizations and grassroots movements are so important, because this doesn't have to happen. And it's really up to all of us to recognize we can't wait for a hero in the legislature. We can't wait for a leader to pop up and show us the right way to do it. We have to be our own champions. And every time I come and speak to the League of Women Voters, I always feel overwhelmed by that feeling because I feel like you all share that sentiment. That's why you're here. Anyway, so that is my somewhat depressing / corny speech. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Again, check us out, sierraclub.org/Virginia. I'm happy to share my contact information with you all if you have any questions or follow-ups, or if there's any opportunity for anyone to learn more about the environment, which, by the way, wasn't my background. And then I got in and realized things are much worse than I originally thought. So always happy to talk about this stuff from someone who's still relatively new to the space.
All right, I know there's a question in the room. Do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. Only if you applaud for me one more time. Again, one applause is actually really making my morning.
Since I'm muted, could you repeat the question?
Sure.
I'd like to know the bill numbers, and could you possibly send them to Joan so that she could
Yes.
put them in the Google Drive for us?
Absolutely, Mary. So Mary just asked me for the bill numbers, which, I wish I was prepared, but I have a million bill numbers in my head. I want to make sure I give you all I don't want this to be fake news. So I'm going to make sure that that's the case. Oh, 1257. That's exactly it. Thank you very much, Arena. I appreciate that. We have great fact checkers in this room already. So that's it. And I will also, Mary asked me to send the rest of the information about other bills and relevant legislation to Joan. I will happily do that, and I'm sure it'll be given to you. Thank you, Mary. That's a great suggestion.
Well, there was a question, I don't know if it was snarky or not, it was one of my members, so it probably was. Were any of those bills sponsored by ALEC?
I don't know about ALEC in particular. We are doing a little bit more of a look at this. ALEC is not the behemoth it used to be. And it's so funny. I was looking through the Sierra Club archives just yesterday of our campaign size, and we have get polluters out of ALEC or whatever. This issue's been over for a long time. What I can tell you is that the natural gas industry has grown its influence all over the country. And we have seen, and this is just true, you can look at presentations from the natural gas industry, and it is word for word the talking points that a lot of the sponsors of this bad legislation are using. They may be tied to think tanks like ALEC, but ALEC isn't the only bad news bear at the game, unfortunately. There's a lot of different ways that we can talk to them. And look, we're not unreasonable about this. We know that there are needs that need to be fulfilled, especially in the energy sector, but we don't think that we should be doubling down on a fuel source that, one, the price is volatile. I mean, the price of natural gas went up 30% during the wintertime, but the price of clean energy is going down. All economic trends show that this is the case. So if we double down on the one that's more affordable, and by the way, that isn't impacted by what's going on with international crises, then we are doing a service to the Virginians. We're actually looking out not just for their livelihoods because it doesn't impact their health or it's good for their health, but we're also looking out for their bottom line. So that's one of the reasons we're doing it. We're not just an environmental organization, we're a consumer organization, we're a justice organization. That's why we feel so strongly about these issues. Anyway, sorry, I could rant about that for a lot longer too, but happy to take another question.
Feel free. If we rely more on electricity because it's cleaner, what thoughts are being given to securing the grid system from cyber and physical attacks?
That is a great question, and I am qualified to answer the first half. I am not a cybersecurity issue. I do know that our grid needs to be improved across the board, just nationally. This might be something for national legislation. I do think that there are some elements of the infrastructure package as well as Build Back Better, don't quote me on this, but I believe to improve grid systems. There is also a need for grid system improvement to increase energy efficiency, which, by the way, once again, in a race between clean energy and dirty fuels, clean energy wins on energy efficiency. More energy efficiency equals less pollution, or it equals less cost to the consumer. Electrification is really important. You might hear some folks try to undermine clean energy advocates, especially when it comes to clean vehicles. Say like, well, you're powering your car with your clean car with energy from a power plant. Well, if we electrify everything, that's not the case, because solar, wind generates electricity. And if electricity is being generated by those sources, then other non-fossil fuel mechanics can be powered by that same electric source. This is the same as true for gas stoves and natural gas heated homes. Again, and this is something that's been studied very long, but like those types of energy are bad for our health. They reduce air quality in your homes and in your communities. And the people that are most impacted by this, by the way, are children. When you look at this, the studies, when you look at the impacts and who's felt it worse, it's mostly children. When I mentioned that toxics report earlier, if you look at nationally, the vast majority of people who live within a mile of a toxic facility who are breathing in that toxic air are children, and 3/4 of them are children of color. So when we're talking about these things, it's not just when we're talking about these policies, sometimes we have a problem of being too wonky, but really the bottom line is that is what we're trying to talk about, is trying to make sure that people's lives get better. And every General Assembly session is a chance to make people's lives better. And so that's why we feel very passionate about these issues.
Wow.
Answer that question.
You sure did. I read an article that said the governor does not have the authority to abandon RGGI.
Yes.
Because it's legislative. Do you agree? And do you think we will remain? What are the odds, etc.?
Sure. A couple things about Reggie. Number one, DQ thought that Reggie was only going to produce about $100 million for communities, based off the marketplace that we're engaging, because like I said, polluters have to pay for the amount of pollution that they emit. We more than doubled that. The participation in RGGI more than doubled that. It's $229 million that now gets back into the communities, and it didn't even raise taxes. That's the beauty of RGGI. Governor Youngkin wants to pull it out because of reasons. Anyway, RGGI is part of the Clean Economy Act and something called the Coastal Resiliency Act that was passed in 2020. That means that RGGI is part of Virginia law. So we do believe that there is legal standing, even though you can participate in RGGI just through the executive. We have it also a line that's a line in the sand through our legislature. So the judicial branch is going to be really important here, but we do think that the governor cannot pull out of RGGI just based off unilateral action. It will take legislative items in order to do so. So again, that's why you've seen some heavy attacks on it through the legislature, but I'm pleased to say that the Senate had held the line on it.
In a meeting yesterday with DEQ, a participant was concerned about the footprint of industrial scale solar. How could that be mitigated? And if I can add something personal, I was a solar lobbyist in 1970, whatever, when we thought it was right around the corner. Is it ever going to be around the corner? That's my question, but Carolyn also has a question.
Sure. So when it comes to solar, and again, I always like to start talking about the benefits of them. Solar has the potential to create like 8 million jobs in Virginia alone over like 5 years if we really focus on it. And that's that's one of the conservative estimates, by the way. Industrial solar, we are also concerned about. Of course, we do not think that we should have to trade or sacrifice natural spaces, especially when it comes to trees, because they play such a vital role in capturing pollution. That said, the alternative usually is natural gas pipelines. And natural gas pipelines are far worse in terms of tree cutting and deforestation than anything that solar is going to produce. Another thing that is important, again, to think about is we talked about the grid system earlier. If you have a community solar system, that goes directly into the grid that is powering those homes. So it actually stabilizes them and makes it a lot more stable. To use the same word, stable in times when you might have otherwise blackouts or other interruptions to the grid system. So if it is a comparison of two wrongs, solar is a much less wrong than the rest. That said, there are absolutely ways to find responsible locations and sightings for solar. Because of the Clean Economy Act, by the way, we have found what they call there's a prioritization for what they call brown sites. These are former coal mines, landfills, just areas that are not desirable or full of any natural spaces. The Clean Economy Act made sure that solar in particular would be prioritized to be built in areas like that. So when we're talking about Appalachia in particular, that's one of those really great opportunities to bring solar, which can bring jobs and lower people's electric bills. So these are great questions. I feel like I'm in a deposition, but I'm killing it. So keep them coming.
There's another question about DEQ, so you might want to tell us what it is. I don't know if everyone knows what it is.
Sure.
Why is DEQ sometimes on the wrong side of issues? I don't know if you could answer that, but you could tell us what DEQ is.
No, my promise to the league and to anyone I speak to is that I will be as candid as possible. And sometimes that gets me a little bit in trouble. But when it comes to the DEQ, which by the way is the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, they are the ones that are supposed to ensure environmental protections for our natural treasures and our livelihood. If you look at their mission, it sums it up. Do they always uphold that mission? No. And I have to mention that they have been severely underfunded over the last few decades, that they are understaffed and they are underutilized. We understand that. And we appreciate the fact that they are in a tough spot when it comes to those things. We should be funding them more. We can fund them more. But we just don't have it. That's not the political will to do so. That said, when it comes to what we consider really important decisions about the livelihoods of communities, DEQ does have authority to protect them, and they don't always do that. And I think that has been seen through, especially over the last few years when it comes to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which has been luckily canceled, and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is in really dire straits, which will hopefully soon be canceled. The DEQ has seemed to prioritize working with polluters as opposed to working with communities. The Environmental Justice Act of 2020 had to change that and said that you have to do a lot more outreach to communities. Because here's the thing, when polluters want a permit that they have to work through DEQ, they work with DEQ for a year, maybe two. And they don't have to work with the community until the 6 months before the permit decision is being made. So by then, there's already a lot of deals, there's a lot of negotiations that have taken place behind closed doors. And we do not think that this is a practice that is just. We do not think that this is a practice that is beneficial to the lives of Virginians, especially the ones who are most impacted by pollution already, because they don't have a foot in the door until the other two are already past the finish line. So that's what we have to really work on. When it comes to equity, we have to look at some of the more mundane things. When it comes to permitting of pollution projects,
Is this going to bother you, Elizabeth?
important.
Sorry.
It's okay. No worries. Aurelia, this is important aspects of making sure that we ensure and promote environmental justice in the Commonwealth.
Okay, there's a question about the Sierra Club having concerns, if they do, about the Dominion wind farms.
Sure.
Planned 27 miles off the shores of Virginia Beach.
Yes. So yes and no, right? So when it comes to wind energy, again, like any other industry in its infancy, it seems like the cost is a lot more than it really should be. And as it's being built, we learn more, and as it matures, the prices go down. That said, the bill that Dominion, the price tag that Dominion is claiming it has, seems a little steep, which is why we want to make sure that there is transparency throughout the entire process. The public should be informed about why it costs X, Y, and Z, or about what X, Y, and Z cost this much. The SEC, the state agency that regulates, that really holds utilities accountable, they need to make sure that they're using every aspect of their power to ensure that consumers are protected from any predatory practice that might be involved in price gouging or anything else. And look, here's the thing. Here's where our skepticism comes in. We know that Dominion Energy has overcharged customers by $1.2 billion since 2015. And by the way, they didn't have to give that money back. There was a little bit of a refund for some folks. I got it. It was $6. So I feel like I was overcharged a little bit more than that. So when it comes to a price tag that is put out by Dominion, which by the way, we appreciate that a utility that historically relied on fossil fuels is now trying to double down on clean energy. We do need offshore wind in order to reach our clean energy goals. But two things can be true. We can be appreciative of that, and we can also be concerned with the price to make sure that people who have to be on the hook for paying the bills that related to this energy source are protected. And really, that's not too much to ask.
Okay, I got one more here. You alluded earlier to flooding being statewide, and the question is, we're used in Northern Virginia, we're used to Alexandria flooding, we're used to Georgetown flooding. We
Sure.
were quite shocked when Arlington had a huge flood about 3 years ago and caused hundreds of millions of dollars. Is there any place in Virginia that is not susceptible to this? And is it climate change related?
No and yes. Everyone is in danger. And I hate to sound like an alarmist, but it's true. You know, the quick science of it is that because of the pollution that we're emitting, there's more heat trapping in the atmosphere. The heat trapping in the atmosphere causes a lot more extreme weather events. And we have to expect those extreme weather events are going to get a lot more frequent and a lot more intense. So really no place, it sounds like I'm like narrating a horror movie. No place is safe, but it really is true. When it comes to climate change, inaction translates into community destruction. And that's where we are. And we have to expect that these consequences are going to get worse because we still have a long way off before we can start redressing the impact that we have made because of pollution. So I don't want to scare anyone, but I do want to hopefully inspire a sense of urgency when it comes to these issues, because once again, and I'm sure you all know this, the reason advocacy is so important is because our legislative officials are going to get the industry perspective the entire time. They have people who are funded, who can lobby the entire time. But what they don't hear, the most minimal perspective that they that they have experience with, is people like us. is people who aren't paid to be there, who's people who are actually impacted by this, who, by the way, are usually from different parts of the state, who might not already have access to transportation, who cannot afford to lose wages in their job. That's not the perspective they're going to hear. And so it's really important that all of us show up when we can and every time that we can, because if we don't, then we have things that, like I said before, let's polluters get a free pass. And when they get a free pass, we all suffer. So that was depressing, but that's honestly, it needs to be said. That said, I do believe localities can lead the charge of climate action when the state fails to do so. So this is not just a state issue. This is a national issue, this is a global issue, but we forget sometimes it's also a community issue. I believe it was the city of Arlington, and I apologize if that's not correct, but I'm pretty sure it is, has committed to doing 100% clean energy, electric generation by 2035. That's huge. I mean, that's one of our biggest cities. And if we have them leading the way, other localities can follow. So we consider, when it's not in session, the off season, but the off season is a great time to make sure that you are able to influence and advocate to your local government, because if they're doing it, then it puts pressure on the General Assembly. This is a two-way street. This is not just the General Assembly gets to dictate the rules. These are also influenced heavily by the localities that they represent and the local leaders that represent those localities.
Of course, I lied. Another question popped up.
Sure.
Do you think that Acting Secretary Wheeler has had any impact on these bills? And this is sort of a subjective question, but.
Sure, and I'm happy to be subjective about Andrew Wheeler. He's terrible. He was terrible at the EPA, and he's going to be terrible for Virginia. He worked tirelessly to roll back environmental safeguards. Who advocates for higher levels of acceptable mercury in water? Andrew Wheeler does. Who thinks that CO2 should be considered carbon pollution? Andrew Wheeler does. Andrew Wheeler is acting as acting secretary, as was mentioned, despite the fact that it doesn't look like there's any pathway for him to become the natural resources. So he's in those meetings. He sounds like a very reasonable person when he's there, but his record does not match his rhetoric does not match his record. That's the problem. So really anything that Andrew Wheeler says, I would take with a grain of salt. And also, I hate to say this, but Andrew Wheeler will probably find some position of power in Virginia, and I do believe that he will use it to benefit polluters at the expense of people. I think in terms of Governor Youngkin's choices, this was probably one amongst the worst ones that he could have done in his administration. But that said, once again, we know that elected officials, especially a governor who is new in town, especially one that doesn't have any political experience prior to this, which is like, I don't know, if government's supposed to be run by a business, why would you hire someone as the leader to be the one who has no experience? But that's a conversation for another time. That they're a lot more susceptible to public pressure. So if we see something like this, again, if you're staying informed with the Sierra Club, we try to argue these things in good faith, which is why when I say that Andrew Wheeler is terrible, I truly mean it. So we're following the situation. We don't think he'll become Secretary of Natural Resources, but he might get another position, and it will be concerning. So if he has any influence on anything, it's negative.
Tell us how you really feel. Okay, thank you. Deb, we don't have any more questions here.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate letting me rant to you for a while.
We're applauding you.
Tim, thank you. Tim, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you with us. And I would share that in my own experience, our HOA does not allow solar panels. And when the law passed, we informed them that we wanted to put in solar panels. They are changing our handbook. And but we've also had our electric and plumbing people argue against us when we want to we just replaced our gas furnace with an electric heat pump to get ready for the solar, and they tried to talk us out of it. So yeah, it's a battle. But thank you. Joan, are we going with, is Mr. Stiles with us?
He is here. He is in,
Okay,
he's
great.
in Zoom world.
Great. Skip Stiles is no stranger to those who were able to attend the league's convention in Norfolk. I can't even tell you how long ago. I believe it was 2 years ago, but it was pre-COVID and gave us a great presentation then 4 years ago. Wow, okay. And Skip is the executive director of Wetlands Watch. Skip, it's so great to have you with us this morning.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all again. Yeah, I remember that meeting. We went up, I think we went up to the top of the hotel the meeting was in, and we looked out over all of the assets that were at risk. I'm gonna go back over some of that ground maybe and set the table for some of the flooding that we're seeing, because actually it's really amazing. In the last 4 years, there has been so much that's happened, both in terms of our estimates of the impact, but also in the response of the state, which I think is what you want to hear about. So I have a presentation that'll help guide me through this, that will provide some background, and I will, there we go, attempt to share it. Oh, that works, I think.
You're good.
All right, so let's go back through some of the basics. So this is what sea level rise looks like over the past 140,000 years. The black line, it goes up and down depending on whether the climate is hot or cold. And from top to bottom, sea level rises and falls about 400 feet, 130 meters, something like that. The last time the sea level was at its lowest, when we had the big glaciers, was about 20,000 years ago. Sea level was down about 360 feet, and this was what we looked like from Virginia's perspective. The shoreline was out at the continental shelf, and Norfolk was it was a long drive from Norfolk to the beach, much longer than it is today. So the last time everything thawed, when things were warmer, was about 120,000 years ago, and sea level was about 5 meters above where it is now. Well, it was about 5 meters above where current sea level is, and this is what the east coast of Virginia looked like when everything was flooding 120,000 years ago. And so you can see Norfolk was basically in the water, and Williamsburg was waterfront property. So if you look at the topography of Eastern Virginia, you'll see the problem that we face, because we have the green areas and the brown areas are very close to the sea level, and those are areas that will flood coming into the future. So there's lots of assets here, the naval base, the shipyard, a lot of population. So the eastern part of the state is going to see a lot of impacts from the sea level rise that's projected to come our way. What's interesting is that the part of this feature is actually a crater rim. That part of Virginia is inside the largest meteor impact crater in North America, and that helped flatten the eastern part of Virginia, and frankly made it much more vulnerable to sea level rise. So we've got a low-lying area, but even worse, we've got the highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast. So over the last 100 years, we've seen about 1.5 feet of sea level rise, which is more than the surrounding areas. Why is it more? About half of what we've seen has been true water level elevating, but in Virginia, in coastal Virginia, our land is sinking. And it's sinking for a couple of big reasons. One is when the glaciers were over New York, they pushed this part of the mid-Atlantic region up into the air. When the glaciers melted, we're falling back to where we were before the glaciers maxed out 20,000 years ago. The other big piece of it is groundwater withdrawal. When John Smith showed up here, our groundwater was about 100 to 200 feet higher than it is now. And we've taken all of that water out for ag and industrial and residential uses, and that's causing the land to fall. There's a small piece of it that's the crater still settling in Eastern Virginia, but it's very, very small. The last big piece of this is that this Gulf Stream, more recently in the last 10 years, they figured out the Gulf Stream is slowing down. And as the Gulf Stream slows down, the water near the coastline rises up because of the Earth's rotation. So we're getting a real triple whammy, high base rate of sea level rise, land sinking, and now the Gulf Stream is slowing down. The other big piece of it, and this is the statewide issue, is that rainfall intensity is increasing. the state just completed a study that showed that rainfall intensity increased about 20% over the last 15 years. And this chart shows that the dotted lines, the bottom dotted line is what the rainfall intensity rate was projected to be. And then when they added some of the more recent years into it, you can see that upper dotted line is where the new projections are. These are the days per year that exceed the 24-hour rainfall. And those colored lines show you that what going into the future, we're probably going to see higher and higher levels of rainfall intensity. And this is due to the fact that the air warms up and it due to global warming, and it holds more water. And when it dumps that water, you get more intense rainfall. Rain events are probably more important than coastal events. The majority of the federal disasters we've had for flooding are riverine flooding in the valley area due to rainfall. So rainfall is the sort of sleeping piece of this whole flooding thing in Virginia. We haven't studied it as much. Just clear impacts. This again is just since we last met. In 2007, we wrote Governor Kane and said, hey, we're Wetlands Watch. So we were concerned that sea level rise was going to, by the end of the century, was going to take out 50 to 80% of our vegetated tidal wetlands. Those are the marshes, the spartina that you see. Well, just last year, the state did a statewide study and said, no, actually, we're going to lose 90% of our wetlands by 2080. That's 20 years earlier. Now, if you lose that many wetlands, you've got no saltwater fishery left in the state, commercial or recreational. And you can see what's going to happen to the beaches as well. So just since we met last time, the projections of the impacts have gone up. Now, what it does on populated areas, this is some work that was done at Old Dominion University. This is what downtown Norfolk and Portsmouth look like in 2060. So the coastal region is really going to get socked and have impacts on the built out areas over the next coming decades. And this is something we've got to prepare for. The response has accelerated. Again, just since we met last time, there've been a couple of more of these studies. The localities in Virginia are doing more and more studies, incorporating into their long-range land use plans these future conditions. So the localities are moving ahead. The problem has been that the state and federal government haven't provided much help. The other thing that's going on is, this is what this looked like the last time we met. If you wanted to adapt to sea level rise, you'd be told, hey, we'll go pick a curve. Well, if you're a locality trying to plan for sea level rise, the difference between the top curve and the bottom curve is crazy. So what the regional government did was they went and did their own research and said, okay, in Southeast Virginia, we're probably going to get 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. Remember, we've had 1.5 feet of sea level rise over the last century. We're going to get that again by 2050, another 1.5 feet by 2080, and another 1.5 feet by the end of the century. Now, this is the only region in the country that's done this on its own, that has actually said, I can't wait for the state or federal government. We've got to deal with this. So this is a significant advance, having these projections. And then to the point of the legislative work, in the last 2 legislative sessions, there's been tremendous progress made. One of the big things is that Virginia decided to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And 45% of the funding that's generated from that comes back into a flood preparedness fund. Now, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a coalition of these states that stretch from Maine to Virginia. And essentially, if you're a power generator, if you're Dominion or APCO or one of the big power generators, and you emit carbon into the atmosphere as a result of generating electricity, you have to go into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is an auction, and you buy carbon credits to buy down the amount of pollution, carbon pollution you've put into the air. And in Virginia, as I said, when they joined this in 2020, they said half of the money goes towards low income energy efficiency to reduce the impact, to reduce energy use. The other half is going to go into this flood fund. And so we had $102 million come into the state for the first time. Virginia's actually spending its own money for its flood fixes. Then in addition, in 2020, Virginia was the first state to put sea level rise into its wetlands regulatory statute, the first state to put climate change into its shoreline buffer, the area behind the wetlands regulatory statute, and the first state to put climate change into septic. This is an important problem in rural areas where, because of increased rainfall or because of sea level rise, septic systems are failing. And so there's a lot of septic failure throughout the state, and the impacts are falling predominantly on lower income residents because they don't have the money to go out and buy the expensive systems that are needed to fix it. So anyway, this is a big step forward. Again, only state in the country. And then also there was a law that said that DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, had to look at how climate change affected all of its programs and policies. This again is significant. As well, at the governor's initiative, Virginia developed a coastal master plan. That was the plan that came up with those updated figures of wetlands impacts. Virginia has joined with surrounding states to update its rainfall estimates. Remember, I showed you that rainfall curve. Well, now we're going to get official estimates from the federal government, and Virginia is going to pay. Well, Virginia and the surrounding states are paying their own money to do it, to get the feds to come back here. And then the Virginia Department of Transportation on its own has developed some absolutely amazing climate change engineering standards. Again, the only state in the country that has these in their engineering standards for the bridges and tunnels. They're now working on the roadways. So we've got Virginia right now poised as a first in the nation state for its impact, for its work on climate change. To the point of one of the interests I know that you all have, in 2021, Representative Congress Fowler patroned and got passed a bill that required disclosure of past flood impacts for real estate transactions. And basically, if a property has had 2 or more claims of $1,000 each in the preceding 10-year period, it has to be disclosed. Now, the issue here is that only about 20% of the properties in a flood zone are covered by flood insurance. And this says the damages have to been paid by the National Flood Insurance Program. So essentially, we're leaving about 80% of the properties outside of this disclosure requirement because they're not in the federal flood insurance program, and they wouldn't have gotten their damages paid for. They would have been paid for by the homeowner. So, or if they have private flood insurance. So this is a significant step forward. It's taken a number of years to get it, but it is still, there are a lot of loopholes in it. Funding is the next big challenge. So everybody says Army Corps of Engineers is going to fix stuff. Well, they've got $109 billion in backlog projects, and they only get about $2 to $3 billion a year. You can do the math on how long you'll wait for the Corps of Engineers to show up. And everybody and their brother right now is putting together plans to flood-proof their region. And this has added another $170 billion to that $109 billion backlog. Now, a significant chunk of money, $17 billion, was made available in the infrastructure package that passed. So for example, Norfolk just got $250 million to build a wall around that part of Norfolk I showed you earlier that was going to turn red by 2060. But there just simply is not enough money around. Some localities that are better equipped, this is Virginia Beach, passed its own bond initiative, a $567 million bond initiative, the second largest flooding bond initiative ever issued in the country. But they, in their own plans, have identified at least $3 billion worth of flood fixes. So going forward, this is going to be the big challenge, is trying to find the money. And I don't know how much you got from the so far, but there is a push in the legislature to eliminate the funding source, to take Virginia out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and eliminate that funding source of $100 million a year that's coming into the state. So that's one of the big fights that we're involved in right now, is trying to keep Virginia in RGGI, so at least we can have that funding stream and begin to move the state forward, especially the rural parts, especially the western parts of the state, to move them forward in their flood planning and their reactions to it. We've got a big bill to pay. Along the coast, we estimate we need about $40 billion, and that's just the down payment. When you bring in the riverine areas, it probably doubles. So we've got a huge amount of needs. And as you saw from those sea level rise curves, we don't have much time to put this program together. So that's one of the reasons why we've been very active, along with Sierra Club and others, in trying to keep the state where it is as sort of first in the country, and keep it from sliding back, keep it from dropping out of a lot of these essential programs like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So with that, I will stop, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. There's a question, are wetlands a carbon sink and therefore a weak buffer to storm surge? And for people like myself, what's a carbon sink?
Okay, so yes, wetlands are a carbon sink. Wetlands, as they grow, they take CO2, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, and they turn it into the parts of the plant that are living. When the plants die back in the winter, the plants sort of turn brown and become part of the soil. And so every year the wetlands are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they're putting it into the ground where it's held permanently until the wetlands begin to go away. And unfortunately, this is one of these nasty feedback loops with sea level rise and the disintegration of the wetlands. That carbon is then re-released back into the atmosphere. So you not only lose the carbon sink, you actually then are releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere, and it becomes a much worse situation. So wetlands are a significant carbon sink globally, and things like the tundra, that I think that's a plant sink that holds a lot of carbon. Well, the tundra is melting, the permafrost is melting, and a lot of that CO2 is being released. So you're getting these really nasty feedback loops. But with wetlands, it's especially pronounced. I mean, if we're going to lose 90% of our wetlands, then we lose 90% of the carbon that's been stored there over the centuries.
Voters in Virginia Beach voted for the governor, and at the same time voted to tax themselves, and you talked about that. Is there an effective way to make the governor understand that this vote was not a mandate to roll back climate change measures? And there's another question that you started to answer, and you did answer. What's happening in the General Assembly? Is any other bills in the General Assembly that are tricky?
Yeah, so I don't know. The governor's administration is a mystery to me, because it has been so, it bounces around a lot. It's hard to figure out who exactly is in charge, because logically you would think that someone like Governor Youngkin, who has spent considerable time in Tidewater, in the eastern part of the state along the shore, would have, one, seen the strength of the voting coming out of Virginia Beach. 70% of the vote was in favor of it, and two, would clearly see the impacts of sea level rise. But I think that what is going on is that there's more of a concern about this carbon tax, if you will, that is the RGGI program, where the power generators have to pay to buy the carbon credits. Well, they're passing it on to consumers. I looked at my bill the other day. I actually have my Dominion bill right here, and it says I'm paying $5 this month for RGGI. Well, that's fine by me, but it's seen as a tax by many on the conservative side, and so that's why they want to get rid of it. The House is voting to get rid of it. The Senate, which, as you know, is in Democratic majority by one vote, the Senate is holding its own right now and saying, no, we're not going to get out of this program. I think that the push to end this program is weakening somewhat. We're doing a lot of outreach in the western part of the state, the red part of the state, if you will, the part that was overwhelmingly supportive of Youngkin, to get those localities aware of this flood program, which is dependent on RGGI. And our hope is that those localities go, wait a minute, nobody's given us a dime to fix our flooding along the Maury River, say, in the western part of the state. Now we're getting money from the state and they want to take it away. I don't think so. So we're hoping that we can build a broader base of support for this program and therefore create the political climate where it's a lot easier to retain, to sustain our membership in RGGI. But this administration has been very, very difficult to deal with because it's been all over the map. It's hard to figure where they are on a given day.
There's a question about birds and creatures adapting. Do we have an idea about adaptation, or are we expecting to see significant extinction?
I think that there is the possibility to adapt, but it would take an awfully long time. What we're seeing in the short run is significant loss of shorebird habitat. There was some interesting work that was done by the Center for Conservation Biology at William and Mary that looked at the loss of nesting habitat along on the dunes and beaches. And that's being repeated for a lot of the birds that are dependent on marsh ecosystems. In theory, they could adapt, but the problem is that there is no new habitat being created. Because we've built along the shoreline, as sea level comes in, over the years, what's happened is the dunes just move back, the eastern shore just moves back, the wetlands just move uphill and they erode the bank and they build new wetlands. But when you've got a city or a bulkhead or a marina or a road in the way, when sea level hits, that ecosystem just drowns in place. And so that's the problem, is that the nesting habitat for these birds is disappearing. There's a significant amount of shift in range of the birds. Duck hunters complain that the ducks no longer come this far south, for example. So they're observing a lot because it's warmer up north. Why am I going to fly another 200 miles to go to Back Bay when I can hang out, up in Delaware? So there's been a significant shift in bird range that they're beginning to observe. So it is having an impact, and it's happening so fast that the birds can't really evolve. In other words, the selection process, the life cycle of a bird is such that you can't select out, okay, I'm doing better in this ecosystem. Well, the ecosystem keeps changing, and so it's very, very difficult for these organisms, for the birds, to adapt.
The graph showing changes in the sea level was very interesting. How fast, do we know, did these changes occur compared to the current pace of sea level rise?
Unfortunately, every time we look around, the rate of sea level rise seems to increase. That letter I showed you that we sent to Senator Kane in 2007, at that time, I remember I was on the state's climate commission. We estimated we were going to see 2.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. The updated graph that I showed you from our regional government says, no, actually, we're going to see 4.5 feet by the end of the century. And that also does not take into account things like the slowing of the Gulf Stream. Virginia and North Carolina are closest to the Gulf Stream in the United States. So when the Gulf Stream slows down and starts pushing water back onto the shore, we're the states that see it. So, that rate of sea level rise of 4.5 feet by the end of the century didn't take into account that change in the Gulf Stream, and it has not taken into account some of the more recent work that's showing an increased pulse of water from the ice caps melting and the rest. So the rate of sea level rise is unfortunately continuing to increase, and that 4.5 feet that was projected by the end of the century is probably going to be more like 6 feet at a minimum. And for anyone who drives around this part of Virginia, 6 feet, 2 meters is it's difficult for me to envision how this part of the state remains intact by the end of the century, to be quite blunt. The other piece of this, of course, is the rainfall intensity. As I mentioned, we're just now starting to get that information together for the western part of the state. The coastal parts have all these federal agencies that do research, like the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration and Sea Grant, Coastal Zone Management. You get to the western part of the state, there's nobody doing that kind of research. So they don't even have, proper river flood gauges to measure what are the impacts. So that's some of the work that needs to be done. But the western part of the state, along 58 and I-81, the south side and the Valley region are really experiencing a lot of impacts, and we're just now beginning to understand them.
There's a question about seawalls. Are they the only protection we have now, or are there other things coming up on the pike?
Right now, for developed areas, if I were, well, if I'm going to be taxed to protect downtown Norfolk, which I will be, that $250 million federal seawall is probably the only thing you can do, because you can't elevate all the buildings, you can't elevate all the, you can't basically take Norfolk and Portsmouth and Newport News and Deltaville and all these other places and just elevate them. There isn't enough money or time to do that. So right now, protecting against the storm surges is going to be a problem. But it's only going to be part of the issue, because the water doesn't just come in and hit a seawall and stop. The water will find its way into the interior of a lot of these cities just from groundwater, from, you know, this is the problem. Water seeks its own level. So it's going to come up underneath at some point. And at that point, there isn't much you can do. There's a lot of work going on to try to prevent shoreline erosion using what they call living shorelines, which is where you build a marsh complex that basically keeps the water from damaging what you've got behind it. If your house is here, you build a living shoreline, and it will dampen the wave energy and protect your house. In the long run, it's not going to protect you. That part of Virginia that is inside that map that I showed you, that's the green zone, I am afraid that the only long-term solution in those areas is to move inland. There are parts of Virginia where we work that just within the last decade have turned into areas where it's very difficult to see how you're going to sustain communities in a lot of these areas. In rural areas, as I said, it's a real problem because of septic systems. The septic systems are basically flooding from underneath, and they stop working. And then you can work around it with these very expensive systems, but it's $30,000 a house. And so for low income, predominantly minority communities in rural areas, there's no solution on the horizon for their flooding. So it's you know, I don't like to be negative and dire about it, but it's hard not to see where, for that green part of the state that I showed you in that earlier map, the long-term solution isn't going to be to try to get out of the way.
Carolyn Kaywood, who lives in your area, put some facts in here. 110,000 people in Virginia would be living below 5 feet above sea level. And she also says that in Norfolk, you can watch the high tide bubble up into the storm sewers in Norfolk streets.
Yeah, we get a lot of that nuisance flooding now. And so, you know, even if your house is safe, if the streets, the older streets in the older cities are at a lower level, you can't get trucks down them, you can't get fire engines down them. So it begins to really impede access. There's a project right now to raise Hampton Boulevard, which in Norfolk is one of the main ways that you get into Naval Station Norfolk, because most of the sailors and officers who work on the base don't live on the base. So those roadways become critical. Well, you can't raise every roadway. There just isn't enough money. So we're going to have to make some rather draconian choices in coming decades. Now, I'm old enough, you can see my gray hair, that it's going to fall on my kids to do that. So, but I don't wish that on them.
We don't have any other questions other than, can you please share the slides? People are coveting your slides.
Oh, certainly. I'll be happy to. In fact, I gave a longer version of this to the Suffolk Rotary Club about a week ago, and I'll give you the longer version of it, which has more slides.
Right. Great. I'll drop that in the Joan.
I'll send that to you, Joan.
Please, I'll drop it in the Google Drive. So just you guys keep checking it.
Okay.
Okay.
Happy to.
Deb, we don't have any more in chat. I don't know if you have any there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Always enjoy getting together with you folks. Take care.
Skip, thank you so much. We appreciate it, your in-depth knowledge, and appreciate your reaching out to the rural parts of the state. That's where I'm from. And when I was at Virginia Tech, Roanoke River was always flooding. And I know we have a leak down in Washington County, and flooding is an issue down there as well. So thank you for reaching out to the other part of the state in your efforts.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Thank you, you too. So that's it for today, but before you run off, want to remind you that we have a rally downtown Richmond tomorrow at the Bell Tower at 10:30 in the morning. That is, although we are unhappy that SJ1, that's the constitutional amendment to provide the right to vote and auto restore it to returning citizens, we're unhappy that that did not make it out of the subcommittee. We think that it's important to let legislators know how important this legislation is to the league and to the people that are affected by losing the right to vote. And so please contact your legislators, come to the Bell Tower tomorrow from 10:30 to 11:30 and make a visible noise about how important voting rights are. If there is nothing else, then have a great day. And our last WLRT will be to next week. And it'll be a wrap up of legislation we've been following this session. So thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you, Deb, and all.